Welcome back. So today I'm looking at Stephen Shoemaker's book, The Quest of the Historical Muhammad, but in particular one of his papers within that book, the Qur'an's Holy House, Mecca or Jerusalem. If you've been following this series, you know that we have argued on this channel that Jerusalem was the original site of the Masjid al-Haram based on all of the various strands of evidence that we have looked at. Now, it's interesting that Stephen Shoemaker has come to the same conclusion. So in this video, I will be picking out some of the key quotations from his paper. So this is a condensed version of his paper. Hopefully I haven't left out anything that's relevant, but I think I've retained the most salient points from his paper. So with that out of the way, let's look at his paper. He says that one of the clearest and most uncontestable facts to emerge from the contemporary Jewish and Christian witnesses to the rise of Islam is that Muhammad's earliest followers were well nigh obsessed with restoring worship and dignity to the site of the destroyed Jewish temple in Jerusalem. I would term that the smoking gun, the key piece of evidence that should really direct our attention. He also says, these eyewitnesses signaled that Jerusalem and the site of its then devastated temple were regarded with the highest sanctity and prayer to the site of the temple, beginning work on erecting some sort of a shrine there almost immediately after they conquered Jerusalem. There can be little question that Muhammad and his early followers regarded the then ruined Jerusalem temple and its location as a holy site of the highest order and quite likely a site of pilgrimage. Of course, they did not imagine themselves as actually restoring the temple itself. God alone would accomplish this at the climax of history. Instead, they were building a structure that could serve a sort of ersatz or substitute temple, a placeholder for the real thing until the arrival of the impending eschaton, which they were expecting very soon, it would seem. The sacred rock at the dome's center was widely believed to have stood in the center of the temple's Holy of Holies, its most hallowed precinct. Almost certainly, it would seem, the dome was erected by the believers to serve as a kind of temporary stand-in for the temple, as they awaited its final divine restoration. The dome was built around a sacred stone which, according to contemporary Jewish tradition, was not only the foundation stone of God's creation, but also the rock on which Abraham nearly sacrificed his son Isaac. So, as he's pointing out there, there's huge significance about this site, especially its connection with Abraham and his son Isaac. It was, according to Jewish tradition, it was where he attempted to sacrifice his son. Shoemaker does refer to monotheism as the top theme of the Qur'an, and he puts the apocalypse and themes around that as the second most common theme. I should say at this point that most scholars, if not all scholars, assume that what is meant by believers is a collection of people who share one thing in common, which is monotheism. Yehuda Nevo is one of the people that have asserted that. Fred Donner would also have said that, and also, as we see here, Stephen Shoemaker. But I think, and I'll show later in this video, I think actually when the Quran is talking about believers, monotheism doesn't cut it, because if the Masjid al-Haram is the Temple Mount, then of course everyone who goes to that is a monotheist. It's not a pagan site, certainly not in the 7th century. So therefore, believers has to have another meaning. And I would suggest that the notion that the Quran has for believers is that believing in the Messianic movement, that this was the apocalypse. So there would have been some Jews that didn't buy it, and some Jews who did believe, especially after Nehemiah ben Huziel was killed in 617 AD, which would have been a huge thing. So with that out of the way, let's continue. Whenever I want to give my own thoughts, obviously it will be distinct from the written text. So the written text will always be Shoemaker's words from his paper. This same rock in Jewish and Christian memory had in fact been housed within the temple's Holy of Holies when it still stood. In light of the considerable importance of Jerusalem's holy house for Muhammad's earliest followers, then one is certainly justified in wondering if perhaps the Jerusalem temple bears some direct historical relation to the Abrahamic holy house of the Qur'an. Now, where I would differ with Shoemaker is in his assumption that there was a Muhammad. I did have a discussion with him at the Nara conference. I think it was on the stairs, actually, and he had just delivered one of his talks on this very topic. So he says, well, are you convinced? And I said, well, it certainly is the simplest solution, which is to posit a single protagonist in line with the supposed author of the Quran. But I think we can't assume that. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that the Jewish tradition posited at least two different types of Mahmeds. But the people that might have held out hope as being a Muhammad or a Mahmed, a Messiah, would have quickly have dashed their hopes because things didn't pan out the way they had hoped. So I think the assumption that there was a Muhammad of history is a mistaken one, and all of the evidence that Shoemaker actually points out in another paper to do with the historical Muhammad in the same book, all the evidence is actually pointing to the lack of tenability, the lack of good or decent evidence for Mecca, and that the story is meant to be around Mecca, but he's actually showing that it really was about Jerusalem. So why should we go the next step and assume that there was a historical Muhammad if most of the story, by his own admission, is likely fraudulent, fictional, particularly the Hadiths, the Seerah, and so on? Why go the extra hog and assume that there was Muhammad? I think he doesn't really give a good enough reason for that, apart from maybe applying Occam's razor and saying it's the simplest explanation. But I think it doesn't have to be that way. It could be that it's a conglomeration of different figures from the 7th century. He says already in the late 19th century, Julius Wellhausen demonstrated convincingly that in late antiquity, Mecca simply was not a major pilgrimage center of any sort. Memories in the early Islamic tradition suggesting otherwise are simply projections of later Islamic practices back onto the blank canvas of pre-Islamic Mecca. And with that, I would certainly agree. Shoemaker assumes that Mecca, like almost everywhere, had some sort of sacred shrine, but the nature of this is hard to say as it has been rebuilt several times. This is essentially a condensation of points that he made in his paper. Therefore, as Gerald Houghton rightly discerns, the Quran already reflects the process of Islamizing certain pre-Islamic pilgrimage practices, which originally were not focused on Mecca, by linking them directly with Mecca and establishing Muhammad's hometown as a distinctively Islamic holy place. Now, here Shoemaker is arguing that he thinks Mecca can be shoehorned back in by saying that it was Muhammad's hometown, and then decades or centuries later, his hometown becomes the site of all of the action. I don't think that's tenable. But in any case, he says, it seems that we may safely conclude that prior to the rise of Islam, Mecca was not in fact some sort of renowned and important holy place, and likewise there is no reason to imagine that the Meccan economy was greatly enriched by the presence of any sort of major pilgrimage shrine. Given then the absence of any evidence for a pilgrimage shrine or a major religious sanctuary in pre-Islamic Mecca, one is certainly justified in wondering whether the Kaaba and the house of the Qur'an should in fact be identified with a shrine in Mecca, as the Islamic tradition has come to interpret these references. So where does the Qur'an place the house? Shoemaker says, after all, the Qur'an explicitly identifies the location of the house only once, placing it in Bakka rather than Mecca, Surah 396, continuing then in the following verse 97 to enjoin pilgrimage to this house in Bakka. Bakka clearly seems to be a different place from Mecca. The Islamic tradition is of course desperate to identify this Bakka and its sanctuary with the Meccan shrine, still revered by Muslims today. In order to remedy the Quran's unambiguous and yet highly inconvenient location of its shrine in Bakka, many later Islamic scholars simply decided, without any actual historical basis, that either Bakka is an older name for Mecca, or else Bakka refers specifically to the Kaaba itself and its immediate surroundings within Mecca. There is, however, no justification for identifying Bakka with Mecca, either in whole or part, other than a determined need to bring the Quran fully into agreement with the Islamic tradition. Nothing allows us to assume that when the Quran says Bakka, it means Mecca, particularly since it correctly names Mecca elsewhere. Where was Mecca then? Well, judging strictly on the basis of actual evidence from ancient sources, rather than wishful thinking, it would appear to indicate a location in Jerusalem, right next to the Jerusalem Temple. If we look to the biblical tradition, which we know has deeply influenced the Quran's traditions, we find in Psalm 84, 6-7, a biblical passage identifying Jerusalem's holy house with a barren place named Bakka. In the context of performing pilgrimage to this Abrahamic house, the Hag in Hebrew and Haggah in Aramaic, and as a loan word, Hajj in Arabic, a practice that the Hebrew Bible, Exodus 23, 14-17, Deuteronomy 16:16, enjoins 3 times during the year for the feast of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. It is a truly remarkable parallel to Quran 3:96-97. Now, if we look at that passage and using St. Murad's translation, we see, surely the first home, which was situated for humans, is indeed that which is by Bakka blessed, and a guidance for the worlds. Evidencing signs are in it, the Ibrahim, and whoever entered it was secure. And for Allah over humans is pilgriming the home. He who was able unto it away, and whoever covered then surely Allah's rich about the worlds. Now, if you are thinking like I am thinking that the grammar here is awful, Murad assures me that the grammar in Arabic is equally awful, and this is a literal translation. A place that is a guidance for the worlds. Well, the temple traditionally was seen that way. You had the core part, which was reserved to the Jews, inside the middle part of the temple. But the outer court was the court of the Gentiles, and the idea was that it was meant to be a place that would guide the Gentiles. So it does fit with the Temple Mount and the temple in mind here. It is also the first house or first home, because according to Jewish tradition, this is the place where Abraham raised an altar. And it is also should be noted that it is a site of pilgrimage 3 times a year by Jews. Scholars have tried to find a reference to Bakka in Mecca to no avail. Shoemaker says that scholars have of course scoured ancient literature searching for some toponym resembling Bakka that could possibly align the Quran's shrine with Mecca, yet always to no avail, accepting only the lone mention of Bakka in this psalm, which draws us instead squarely into the orbit of the Jerusalem's holy house, the temple. So isn't that interesting? The only place where Bakka is mentioned outside of the Quran is in that one mention in the psalm in the Bible. As in the Quran, a place named Bakka appears just once in the Hebrew Bible in Psalm 84:7, where the valley of Bakka is closely linked with the Jerusalem temple, which the psalm implies stood very near to this biblical valley. Even more importantly, however, there is complete agreement among scholars of the Hebrew Bible that this particular Psalm 84 is a pilgrim psalm, giving voice to the experience of pilgrims to Jerusalem as they draw near to the temple. Psalm 84 is a hymn connected with the events of actual pilgrimage to the Jerusalem temple. One scholar has even proposed that it should be understood as a liturgical text used by pilgrims at various stations along the way to the temple itself, with the Valley of Bakka being the staging area for their final ascent onto the Temple Mount. And down below, you see examples of scholars who have posited that Peter's work, Jerusalem Processional, and so forth. Okay, there's 3 there if you want to look those up. Shoemaker goes on, and regardless of what the psalmist's intent may have been, in Jewish tradition, the Valley of Bakka soon became a location associated with ancient pilgrimage to the temple. According to Jewish tradition, the Valley of Bakka lies somewhere in the vicinity of the temple, and various specific locations have been proposed. For instance, the Haggadic Midrashim on the Psalms suggests that the Valley of Bakka is the Valley of Gehenna to the east of the Temple Mount. In the Quran, it's called Yahanam or Yahin, and this is the location indicated on the picture there. And here we can see it again. You can see it at the bottom part of the city there in the map, Hinnom Valley, which of course links with the Kidron Valley there. Now, something else to bear in mind is the fact that you have Mount Scopus and Mount Moriah there as well in Jerusalem. There's the Mount of Olives. There's Mount Moriah, Marwa. A little bit more on that later, why we're certain it is the same as Marwa. We have Mount Scopus over here, or Mount Safa, according to Flavius Josephus's Jewish Antiquities. We have the Kedron Valley there, the Valley of Decision. Okay. So the Valley of Gehenna occurs as Jahannam or Jahin in the Quran. Nevertheless, Bakka is most frequently identified with a valley to the west of the Temple Mount, so that to this day it bears the name Bakka. So there is, in the tradition, dispute about where exactly next to the Temple Mount Bakka is. The key thing is there's no dispute about the fact that Bakka is next to the Temple Mount in Jewish tradition. In this place, according to prevailing memory, ancient pilgrims to the temple would gather in preparation to make their ascent to the Temple Mount. As Hakim explains, in this psalm, the Valley of Bakka refers to those who go up to the temple and pass the parched, waterless Valley of Bakka on the way. This interpretation finds support in the Arabic. According to Jewish tradition, then ancient pilgrims to Jerusalem's holy house would assemble just to the southwest of the Temple Mount, pass through the nearby valley of Baca on their way up to the temple. While the Septuagint and Vulgate rendered Baca as weeping, this is incorrect. In Hebrew, the word Baca refers instead to the balsam shrub, and since this shrub grows only in waterless regions, its mention here designates this valley of balsam shrubs as a barren and waterless place. How interesting then that the Qur'an's holy house is not only located in a place called Baca, where it drew pilgrims, but the Qur'an also specifically indicates that its location near a valley where no crops are sown, 1437. On the basis of these two passages, it would certainly appear that the Qur'an's holy house was in the same place visited by the Jewish pilgrims of Psalm 84. Indeed, if we look more closely at Quran 3:96-97, the linkage between what the Quran names the first house, the Islamic Beit al-Maqdis, and Jerusalem's holy house, the Beit ha-Mikdash, only becomes more apparent. So you have Maqdis and Mikdash there, very close. As Rainier observes, in both the Quran and the Hebrew Bible, the place named Baca is a habax legomenon. What does that mean? It means that it only occurs once in the entire text, but its occurrence in both writings in the context of pilgrimage to the Holy House is too remarkable to be mere coincidence. So, in both cases, Baca is mentioned only once, so once in the Quran, once in the Hebrew Bible, and they are also mentioned in the context of pilgrimage to the Holy House. So that seems like a double whammy of a coincidence. As Neuwirth has observed on numerous occasions, that would be Angelica Neuwirth, the Quran indicates great reverence for Jerusalem and the temple, whose traditions were only later transferred onto Mecca and its shrine, a point on which we find ourselves in full agreement with her. It is only in respect to the timing of this transfer that we would disagree. So Neuwirth would basically think it all occurred during Muhammad's lifetime, but Shoemaker is willing to suggest that it might have happened over decades or perhaps even centuries after the time. Rather than this occurring all during the tradition's lifetime of Muhammad, it seems far more likely that all of these things, the formation of the Quran and the faith of Islam, as well as the transfer of the believers' sacred geography from Jerusalem and its temple to the Hijaz and the Meccan shrine, took place over the course of decades after Muhammad's death, or should I say, the supposed death of Muhammad, of course, the Muhammad of the traditions. Ironically, this close correspondence has certainly not been lost on many Muslim exegetes, who often assert that in Psalm 84, the Hebrew Bible directly refers to the ancient sanctuary founded by Abraham at Mecca, since for them Baca is the same as Mecca, albeit presenting the Meccan shrine in a deliberately obscured and disguised form as the Jerusalem temple. We know, for instance, that the pilgrimage traditions and shrines of the Jerusalem area determined the shape of the Quran's traditions of the Nativity of Jesus, particularly in Surah 19. Since the Quran clearly shows reverence for the traditions of the Church of the Katisma, major Marian shrine just 3 miles or 5 kilometers south of the Temple Mount, it is hardly a reach to suggest that the vanished Jerusalem temple was the Abrahamic holy house initially revered by the Quran and its community. One wonders that there has not previously been much prior consideration of the possibility that the Quran's holy house is somehow directly connected with the holy house of biblical tradition, the place where Abraham offered sacrifice in the land promised to him and his descendants. The Qur'an says twice that the house is located at the standing place of Abraham, Surah 2, 125 and Surah 3, 97. What else is this if not the place where Abraham stood before God to offer his son as a sacrifice, only to be stopped at the last minute? Genesis 22, 1 to 14. This legend of Abraham's near sacrifice of his son and their mutual sacrifice of a ram to God, of course, served to establish the temple's location on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. So that's why King David built the temple where he did. It's because this was the location, according to the traditions, where Abraham attempted to sacrifice his son Isaac. That's the whole point of it. In Surah 2, 158, the location of the house is associated with two symbols or signs, Sha'iri, of God specified as Al-Safa and Al-Marwa, further explaining that it is allowed for pilgrims to the house to walk around in them, presumably indicating that these are places. Indeed, judging from the Qur'an alone, one would have no idea that Al-Safa and Al-Marwa were the names of two small rock outcroppings in Mecca. So here we see a bird's eye view there. These are tiny, tiny little rocks, which is easy to house, and hardly the mountains that might be suggested. To my knowledge, the first evidence locating either Al-Safa or Al-Marwa anywhere near Mecca is an inscription in Mecca from 783 AD, indicating the direction of Al-Safa more than 150 years after the traditional date of Muhammad's death. Otherwise, the first sources to identify the Quran's Al-Safa and Al-Marwa with locations in Mecca that I have found are the early 9th century biographies of Muhammad by Al-Waqidi and Ibn Hisham and Al-Azraqi's History of Mecca, all of which were written nearly 200 years after Muhammad's death. Now, even that inscription in 783 could potentially have been forged much later. This is one of the issues we have to kind of consider. But in any case, it's still very late. Such late witnesses clearly offer no basis for concluding that in the early 7th century, Al-Safa and Al-Marwa would have been identified, these Meccan crags. At the same time, however, there are locations in Jerusalem that can readily be identified with these place names, as Robert Kerr has recently pointed out, namely Mount Scopus and Mount Moriah, the latter being the site of the temple itself. Mount Scopus, which lies just a little over 1 mile northwest of the Temple Mount, takes its name from the Greek word scopus, which means a lookout or watchman. As far back as the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus, this high ridge was known as both Scopus and Saphain, or Lookout Mountain, if you will. In Hebrew, the name of the mountain is Har HaSophim, the mountain of the lookouts, at least as far back as the beginning of the 3rd century, as attested by the Mishnah and seemingly Josephus before it, where it is mentioned in conjunction with the Passover pilgrimage and sacrifice. The singular form of Sophim is Sofa, a term that is consistently translated in the Septuagint using the Greek singular scopus. Safa is therefore easily understandable as an adaptation of the Hebrew Sofa to the patterns of Arabic morphophonology. As for Marwa, one need look no farther than Mount Moriah itself, the location of the temple, and of Abraham's near sacrifice of his son. And here we find a key detail. The constants Y and W regularly alternate in early Arabic. Such close correspondence of these Jerusalem place names to the Quranic Al-Safa and Al-Marwa is surely more than mere coincidence, particularly when both pilgrimage and the Holy House are in view. So these are the locations that he mentioned there. Now, we also need to consider circumambulation, Surah 2, 125 to 127. Li el ta'ifina can simply mean those who go about the house. It was customary in early Judaism to circumambulate the temple in times of pilgrimage, as the rabbis continued to remember. On the other hand, it remains entirely possible that the Islamic practice of circumambulation was only introduced at a later time, perhaps on the basis of the Qur'an, as others have suggested, such as Hotin there. One should note that in Jerusalem's sacred house, the sanctuary of its Holy of Holies was in fact in the shape of a cube. 1 Kings 6:20, which is of course the meaning of the word Kaaba. Now, as we'll see in a later episode, Robert Kerr also offers another meaning for the word Kaaba in addition to cube, and that's very interesting. We'll come to that later. No indication in this verse that the Kaaba was in Mecca or anywhere else in the Hijaz, and likewise there is nothing that would preclude its identification with the Jerusalem temple. The house also appears in Qur'an 106, which enjoins its audience to worship the Lord of this house, who has protected them. Yet there is no reason at all why this house of the Lord should be identified with Mecca rather than Jerusalem. Certainly, the mere reference to Quraysh in this extremely obscure surah does not settle the matter in any way. Daniel Beck suggested that the surah could be understood as about seasonal pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Now, as we saw recently in this series, there is a suggestion by the linguist that Quraysh is a word which is used for a temple or a sanctuary based on the Ugaritic. So even that part that seems like it's a stumbling block actually makes sense in this wider context again. The only remaining Quranic passage to mention the Holy House is in Surah 8, 34 to 35, which reproves the unbelievers for preventing the righteous from worshipping at the inviolable place of prayer, Al-Masjid al-Haram, describing the prayers offered by the unrighteous at this house as amounting to nothing more than whistling and hand-clapping. How this reference to the unbelievers' prayer at the house could be reconciled with the Jerusalem temple is admittedly not entirely clear, since at the time the temple lay in ruins and deliberate neglect. Now, I just wanted to point out something there just as we go along. Here you can see that there's a reference to the unbelievers, but it doesn't make sense that the unbelievers are not monotheists, because it's preventing a certain group from worshipping at the temple. In the 7th century, there are no pagans going to the temple or preventing others from going to the temple. The Christians are believers, they're monotheists, so are the Jews. So the unbelievers may simply just be, as I mentioned earlier, those who don't go along with the messianic belief of the time. So, to reiterate, if the site is the temple, then the believers or unbelievers can't be classified as to do it with monotheism, but whether they were messianic believers or not. Therefore, we can deduce that some Jews accepted that they were living in messianic times, while others did not. So just to be clear, this is not Shoemaker's point, this is my own point here. There may have been a little temple over the site, as suggested in A.J. Juice's recent paper, and you can see the little temple depicted there on the mosaic. There is no guarantee that this particular passage addresses circumstances directly relevant to the experiences of Muhammad and his followers. At the same time, however, the reference here to people being kept away from this holy place is entirely consistent with the state of the temple in late antiquity, as well as the refusal of the Roman authorities to permit anyone to pray there. While some early Muslim commentators interpreted as the Meccans blocking Muslim access. A number of commentators understood this passage instead as a reproof concerning the barring of Muslims by the Byzantines from the Jerusalem sanctuary. And this comes from Suleiman Bashir in relation to Surah 214. So interestingly, early Muslim commentators are not unanimous about what it means. Some of them are actually saying it concerned the barring of Muslims by the Byzantines from the Jerusalem sanctuary. So they're giving the game away. This is another smoking gun, which really goes to support the overall thesis here in this paper. So again, it's not just non-Muslims that are arguing that Jerusalem was the original site. It's actually some early Muslim commentators who are not maybe singing from the same hymn sheet are giving the game away here. I kind of think of it as a blip in the matrix, a memory linked with the Jerusalem temple. Shoemaker says this instance surely preserves in its own right a compelling vestige of the considerable significance that Jerusalem and its ancient temple held in the sacred geography of Muhammad's earliest followers. In each instance, the phrase inviolable place of prayer can intelligibly be understood as referring in some sense to the Temple Mount, even in the so-called night journey, 17:1. There is no indication that either shrine, Masjid al-Haram or the Masjid al-Aqsa, was located in Mecca. Only the later interpretive tradition supplies this location and not the text itself. If masjid is simply translated as temple, then this well could apply to the Temple Mount. Take 17:7 here. When the final promise has arrived, so that they will aggrieve your faces, and they will enter the masjid as they entered the first time, and completely destroy what they conquered. You remember the first time the Romans entered, which is 70 AD, they entered and destroyed the temple, so it still makes sense in the context of the temple. As Shoemaker says, the references in this passage to the final promise and conquest indicate a context of eschatological anticipation and military conquest. The one other use of the final promise, Wadu Lakhirati, in verse 104, is unmistakably referring to an eschatological event. And after that, we said to the children of Israel, dwell in the land, and when the final promise has arrived, we will bring you a throng. It would appear that the masjid of verse 7 is found in the land of the Abrahamic inheritance, and it will be restored to his descendants along with the land at the eschaton, a meaning that should also presumably extend to the masjids of the surah's first verse as well. So, where is the place of the Abrahamic inheritance? Well, it's obviously Israel, primarily. Since we know that Jerusalem was in fact the original direction of prayer for Muhammad and his followers, there is then all the more reason to assume that the Qur'an's Masjid al-Haram, the inviolable place of prayer, was originally identified with Jerusalem and its temple. Bashir also notes that some early Islamic commentators located the site of Abraham's near sacrifice as Jerusalem. They are split between both locations, Jerusalem and Mecca. The Ishmael Mecca interpretation does not seem to have achieved any prominence before the end of the first Islamic century. So there's a switch from Isaac and Jerusalem to Ishmael and Mecca. And this has happened to basically take everything back from Judaism. Here Shoemaker brings up the principle of embarrassment. It is unlikely that such a tradition, i.e. linked with the Jerusalem temple, would have been fabricated much beyond the early history of Muhammad's new religious movement, since it directly contradicts the construction of a distinctly Islamic, Abrahamic Holy Land in Mecca and Medina, as an important marker of confessional distinction from Judaism and Christianity. That's an excellent point. Why would they bring this up about Jerusalem unless it's true? But we must understand that the traditions of the Qur'an remained a work in progress, seemingly for decades. And therefore, it is no great surprise to find that in its presentation of the house, the early identification of this Quranic shrine with the Jerusalem temple has become increasingly blurry as other currents influence the emerging collective memories of Muhammad's followers. The apocalyptic desires of Muhammad and his earliest followers were likewise focused squarely on the liberation and reclamation of the Promised Land as well as its holy house, which of course would be on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So that's it for today. That is Stephen Shoemaker's paper. What do you think of that? Leave your comments below. Talk to you all very soon. Bye bye.